Now, we are going to jump right into our program because I want to save lots of time for questions and answers. And with that, to do the honors, I call upon our mayor, Tom Barrett, to do the honors.
Well, good afternoon. I was here last week, and I guarantee you today will be much more interesting. I'm happy to be back again, and I'm very excited because you are in for what I believe is going to be a real treat. And I want to share with you my involvement in having Sam here. Last fall, I was in Madison. I was in the state capitol, and I was visiting with state legislators. And one of those legislators I visited was Luther Olson, who represents the area around the Dells, that part. And he mentioned that he had just read an interesting book, or actually had listened to it on tape as he drove back and forth to Madison, called Dreamland. And it was about the opioid crisis and about heroin and the interaction of those. And I thought it was interesting because, as I'll explain to you in a minute, that's a very relevant issue here in the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. So I picked up the book and I read the book. And I found it to be a fascinating book. And I will say to you the same thing that my high school senior English teacher said to our class. Get the book, read the book. It is available in the back of the room. I get no royalties at all, but I guarantee you, it is worth your time to read this book. It is a real eye-opener for those of you who haven't followed this issue of opioids and heroin more closely. And this is an issue that has been in our country for a while, but as you read through the book or as you look at real life, it is an issue that has grown tragically by leaps and bounds. And it's relevant to our community, and I'll share with you, because I brought some statistics over, why it's so relevant for our community. In 2004, we had 117 overdose deaths in Milwaukee County. By 2011, that number had risen from 117 to 180. In 2017, we had 401 overdose deaths in Milwaukee County. Now, to put that in perspective, back in 2004, we probably had around 117 or maybe 120 homicides in the city. Last year, we had 119 homicides in the city, and yet you look at the overdose deaths, they have well more than tripled in that time period. This is a very serious public health issue in this community, in this state, and in this nation. And I didn't have the ability, because I thought we're here to hear Sam, not to hear me, but I do have a map here of the city of Milwaukee. And you can't see it other than to see a map, and there's lots of little dots on this map. And that's because this comes from our fire department, where in 2017 we had 2,909 overdose calls in the city of Milwaukee. And what's most striking about this map is it's everywhere. It is everywhere in this city. The highest concentration is on the near south side, and that might have to do with the fact that you've got perhaps heroin coming from Mexico to that neighborhood. I don't know. Sam might have some thoughts on that. But if you look at the Narcan, which has been a very effective tool, 1,080 patients were treated by our fire department with Narcan last year. Again, the map is the entire city. And it doesn't stop at the city boundaries. This is in the suburbs. It's a huge issue in rural parts of this state, in rural parts of this nation, as Sam can share with you. So this is not a theoretical conversation we're having. What you have is the intersection of heroin coming from Mexico, and you've got big pharma and very aggressive sales that have occurred over the last 2 decades because of an obsession of making sure that people had no pain. And because of that, we've got more and more people who are using these opioids. And I think anytime you see someone who's using heroin, you can probably bet that they started with opioids. Because it's less expensive to use the heroin. But the reason I found Sam's book so compelling is it's not a treatise. It's a story. It's many, many stories. And you can see that he's a reporter by the way he tells the stories. And so there's real people, talks about 501 genes and the importance of 501 genes in Mexico, talks about, again, the changes in medicine as to how pain became one of the real indicators that doctors ask about. Think about it. 30 years ago, they didn't show you that piece of paper with the smiley faces about how much pain you had. Now they show it to you. When I finished reading the book, I thought, we got to get this guy here. So I called Paula Kiley, our librarian, and said, can we get him here to talk to our community? And she said, I'm interested in doing that. And then I called my friend Susan Lloyd and said, Susan, I know that this is an issue that's important to the Zilber Foundation. Would you be willing to help out? So I want to thank you very much, Susan, and the Zilber family for helping out on this issue to underwrite his trip here. But we felt it was important for him to speak not only tonight at Centennial Hall, but to be here as well today. Again, he's a reporter with many, many years experience, but I think it's safe to say that since he wrote this book, that this has been one of the major chapters of his life. Because I don't know, and I think just talking to him here, I don't know that he anticipated the response that he was going to get to this book, which is basically 3 years old, but is as hot now, and probably hotter than the day that it was published. So please join me in a very, very warm welcome to Sam Quinones. Sam, welcome to Milwaukee.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. Thanks a lot. All right then. How you guys doing? Everybody good? Good to be in Milwaukee, Rotary Club. Someone take my picture with this sign on the back, please. Send it to me. I'm going to send it to my wife because, as the mayor was saying, when I started this book, Dreamland, I told her, honey, when the book comes out, it's going to be 3 to 6 months and we're going to be on to the next project. There's a problem that's nationwide, it's coast to coast, every state in the country, but no one cares about it. No one wants to talk about it. And mainly that's what I believe, because I was running into a kind of a deafening silence all across the country, particularly from families who had lost loved ones, you know. And I just thought as a member of the media that if you don't have the families, you don't have much. And so media wasn't covering it, politicians didn't pay attention to it the way they should, and therefore I thought the book would fail. And then now I'm 3 years into this. This is basically what I've been doing for a while now. And speaking to groups like the Rotary was just really beyond our conception as a family, honestly. But anyway, it's great to be here. I think I've been to Milwaukee 3-4 times in my life. I spoke at Marquette at one point. I'd like to thank the library folks, Paula, Eileen, for bringing me here. Mr. Mayor, thank you very, very much for your kind words about my book, Silver Foundation. It's really very nice. And to all of you for taking the time to listen to me. This is a huge problem. What's fascinating about it, or maybe disturbing, I'm not sure, is that as your mayor just said, overdoses have been rising as crime has been falling. Right? It's kind of a happy face on a very disturbing problem in the background. You know, we have a country where crime rates are lower than ever. In Los Angeles, we had 280 homicides last year. Last time we had 280 homicides in Los Angeles was 1967, when we had 25-30% fewer people. No gangs, no street gangs in Los Angeles. You go around many, many neighborhoods, no street gangs, right? But our heroin problem's through the roof, even though it's still quiet. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some ideas. It's that we don't have a whole lot of time, so there's a lot that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm happy to, if you have questions, feel free. Again, this is the deadliest epidemic, drug epidemic we've ever had in modern America, at least since World War II, certainly. It's unique in the fact that it does not start with drug traffickers, does not start with drug peddlers, mafias, and the usual suspects. It starts with doctors. Doctors accepting and buying into an idea that would have astounded earlier generations. That idea was that narcotic painkillers, opioid painkillers, derived from the opium poppy, were now known, science now knew, supposedly, that these pills were virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain for everybody. Very little nuance. There are reasons why doctors didn't suddenly just come up with this idea. There was a a long process through which they were pressured, pushed, nudged, and this began first by pain specialists, people who were in the specialty of treating pain. There were younger guys wanting people to more aggressively treat pain. They believed these pills were the tools which would do so. But then also by the the medical establishment. One move that took place was they believed that pain was the fifth vital sign. This was an important moment in convincing doctors nationwide that they needed to now treat pain in a more aggressive way. Of course, pain is not a vital sign. Vital sign is something that keeps you alive. Pulse is a vital sign. Pain was not a vital sign. It's something you can't measure objectively. And it became the only vital sign that you want to get down to zero. I mean, you don't want to get your pulse down to zero. But doctors were beginning to be pressured to get pain down to zero. Pharmaceutical companies joined this certainly by the early 90s. Back then, there was a pharmaceutical arms race, sales force arms race. So old sales reps, 35,000 sales reps in the United States in 1993. By 2000, there was 100,000 sales reps drug sales reps in the United States. Before, the sales rep job had been kind of stodgy, old. The guys were kind of slow-moving, older men mostly. But you know what? They knew their product. They knew it very well. Doctors would rely on these older guys for advice about certain pills and so on. By the 1990s, that was changing. You had a huge number of younger people coming in. Very good looking, very young. A lot of them started off in enterprise rental-car, computer gadgets. If you could sell that, you could sell pills. It was a hard sell. It was giveaways. It was stuff at they found that it didn't take that many gifts to get people in a doctor's office to think you were a fantastic person. So bring lunch. They were constantly bringing lunch. They bring hats. The company that made OxyContin was classic in this. They didn't hire the most sales reps. They had about 1,000. Pfizer had 12,000. But they were the only company selling a narcotic in this way. Other companies were selling Lipitor and cholesterol drugs and whatnot. This was the only company selling a narcotic. At the same time, as Americans, we began to have this feeling like we were exceptional and we'd won the Cold War. Right? We began to feel, first of all, that the free market was some kind of undoubtable benefit. And number two, that we were kind of exceptional and wanted a bit of a break from the complications of dealing with the world for 50 years fighting the communists. And so we wanted easy, we wanted convenient. Increasingly, patients wanted quick, too. They wanted a solution that day. They wanted to be seen that day, a diagnosis that day, and a solution. And by the way, they weren't really going to be being too accountable. So when the doctor says, well, part of your pain is that you're overweight, part of your pain is you smoke, part of the pain is that you drink, on and on, all these kind of wellness ideas, you don't exercise enough. As Americans, as a culture, we began to say, I'm not going to do that. I want you to fix me. Our bodies were cars. The doctors are increasingly viewed as car mechanics. You got to fix me, and I'm going to take it, and by the way, I'm not really going to be part of the solution. You fix me. If not, I'm going to give you a bad evaluation. Doctor evaluations were a big part of this. They were a way for patients to extort pills from docs. As this kind of got going, you had those 0 to 10 scales, those smiley face pain scales, right? And the idea was that these pharmaceutical salespeople, but also really American culture was that these narcotic painkillers were virtually non-addictive, and there was a very serious corollary to that. If they're non-addictive, then it doesn't matter how many of them you prescribe to a certain. So you began to see people going in for surgeries. I was one. I had surgery. I had my appendix out. They gave me 2 Vicodin a day for 2 days, sent me home with a bottle of 60 Vicodin for pain that was going to last 2 more days. 4-day pain, 60 Vicodin. That's 30 days worth of pain medicine. Why? Because they're virtually non-addictive. Doesn't really matter. Nobody explained what they were. I thought they were Tylenol kind of. I didn't really actually know what the hell they were giving me. Right? American patients, this was a culture in America that really wanted quick and easy. At the same time, doctors have no time. Right? Managed care means you're churning patients through. You got 12, 13 minutes per patient, particularly for primary care docs. Well, the pills are perfect for that, right? You pull out a prescription pad, appointment's over, you're on your way. So pretty soon people were prescribing, doctors were prescribing huge amounts for all kinds of things. Dentists began to prescribe enormous amounts for wisdom teeth extraction. 5 million people get their wisdom teeth out every year in this country. Most of them get 60, for 20 years, most people were getting 60 Percocet, 60 Vicodin to take home with them. Because there was an idea that was purveyed by pharmaceutical companies, pain specialists, but also pushed by us, by Americans, you know? And a lot of this took place through the 90s. Kind of a graduate, medical schools began teaching this. Medical establishment begins to believe there were an epidemic of pain and that the very way to treat the epidemic was massive amounts of drugs. And so we have this huge, unprecedented supply of narcotics spread from coast to coast. And a lot of that begins to create a black market. But you know what? We did this thinking we were in a little bubble. We were inoculated from the pressures of the world. And that's not true. It can't happen that way. So, OxyContin was a game changer in all this. One way it was a game changer was that before OxyContin, people would mess around with little small dose Vicodin, Percocet, but they would never develop serious levels of addiction. Because all those pills had abuse deterrents. They had Tylenol, they had Acetaminophen. So by the time you were developing anything remotely close to a desperate, very scary addiction, you had done significant damage to your internal organs. So people didn't really switch from that to heroin. There was no bridge to heroin until OxyContin. OxyContin comes out, it's 40 milligrams, it's 80 milligrams, there's no abuse deterrent, it's 160 milligrams for a while. People developed an enormous new tolerance to a daily habit with OxyContin, something that they had never been able to develop on these other pills, and that made them desperate. They couldn't sustain on the black market. These pills are going for $1 a milligram. So you're doing 150 milligrams a day. That's 150 bucks. You cannot sustain that. So they began to look around for an alternative, something very, very potent and just as and cheaper, much cheaper, but very, very potent, if not more so. And that's when this story collides with another story that none of us knew about, except for the DEA. And that has to do with our heroin market. You will remember if you, I'm 59, I grew up in the 70s watching all those great movies out of New York City, Serpico and the French Connection and all that stuff. That's about a dated heroin market. That's a market where most of our heroin came from the Far East through New York City. New York City was a big gateway for all that heroin. Came from Turkey, came from Burma, Thailand, etc. Got here, crossed 2 continents and an ocean to New York City. By the time it got to an addict's arm, it was extraordinarily expensive and very weak. Been cut, been diluted, etc. 1980s, all that changes. The Colombians are huge. The Colombian cartels are big. Mexicans aren't quite there yet, but they're getting there. Both those guys begin to supply heroin to our country in greater amounts, and their heroin outcompetes all that heroin coming from the Far East. So their heroin gets here cheaper and far more potent than the stuff coming from the Far East. By the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, all of our heroin's coming from Mexico or Colombia. Usually today, really, it's almost all from Mexico. Extraordinarily cheap and very, very potent, and nobody noticed. Why did nobody notice? Because there was a bunch of other problems we had with drug crack, meth, etc. And the heroin was like this footnote. Nobody noticed until we began as a country creating an enormous new supply of opiate addicts through overprescribing of narcotic painkillers. And those people on OxyContin began to see their daily habits rise to $150, $200, $300 a day. They begin looking around for some alternative, and they find it in cheap, potent Mexican, today mostly Mexican heroin. We would not have a heroin problem today in America were it not for OxyContin, kind of tenderizing the terrain. We would not have the same heroin problem today if we had all that heroin come from the Far East, because it's not the same alternative. It's not as potent, it's much more expensive, but this heroin coming from Mexico is both potent and very cheap, and so people switch. And when they switch, a lot of times, because of the potency, because of the easy accessibility, they die. And this is the story kind of what's happening in America today. But you know, a lot of this starts in Appalachia, Rust Belt areas. That's where pharmaceutical marketing was the most intense in the 1990s. The ground zero would be like Columbus, Cincinnati, Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, West Virginia, parts of Virginia. That whole area very roughly is their ground zero. But by the time I was on this story, it was way beyond that. It was all these very, very well-to-do suburbs. Charlotte, Salt Lake, Indianapolis, Orange County is our beltway in LA. Heroin beltway in LA is Orange County, California, Disneyland, the beaches, right? And that's when I started this book thinking that I was writing a book about, I'm a crime reporter by training. I thought I was writing a book about drug trafficking. I didn't love that kind of stuff. Man, this is the coolest thing. You know, write about it, you know, cool book about I thought it was about drug trafficking, and then I began to realize it was about something much deeper than that. It was about our country. It was about, if you were writing about heroin, you were really right. It was a wonderful, or a sad but wonderful way of writing about America. It was about who we had become as Americans, what we had become as a country. At the root of that, I think, was that we had, I believe, the root of this problem, I believe, came to believe, as I wrote more and more about it, was that we have spent in this country 35 years destroying, in one way or another, destroying community. We exalted the private sector, came to believe that the free market was some infallible God. You know, we began to believe that government was some pernicious, dull kind of force in the way. We had a president who said that government is the problem, as if to kind of deny the great American experiment, which is that government comes from us. Now it was kind of an invading force. I lived in Mexico under the one-party state in Mexico that ended in 2000 when Vicente Fox won the presidency, and I could tell you that I've seen government at its worst. And the government has its problems, there's no doubt about it, but we took that far to an extreme. We exalted the private sector, began to believe that it could kind of do no wrong, it seemed to me. We had think tanks that posited the idea that government was the biggest threat to personal freedom in this country. And yet, you know, I was in the middle of doing a story that was really about how the private sector, not drug traffickers, but the legitimate private sector in this country, had created the greatest drug scourge that this country, the deadliest drug scourge this country had ever seen, unleashing what I believe one of the greatest threats to personal freedom, which is opiate addiction in America today. As I was doing the story, the only people I was talking to were coroners, CDC, cops, prosecutors, public health nurses, jailers, all of whom were earning a government salary. That was the thin gray line, or with a thin line, fighting this problem when nobody else knew about it and nobody else cared. They did so thanklessly, quietly, sometimes under threat of lawsuit. In this story, all profits are private. The Sackler family, which owns Purdue, is now one of the wealthiest families, wealthier than the Rockefellers, valued by Forbes at $14 billion due to $35 billion worth of sales of OxyContin since the drug came out. All the costs, as I'm sure your mayor and maybe your county officials can tell you, borne by jails, courts, coroner's offices, public health departments, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also a bigger story, too, I began to realize. It was that, but there was various layers to this story, it seemed to me. And one of them was that as Americans, we began to believe in silver bullets, easy answers to complicated adult problems. I think some of our founding ideas got twisted in our search for convenience, for comfort. So self-reliance, great American ideal, became isolation. Everybody just in their own little bubble. Accountability became tantrums, as if a doctor or a cop or a politician didn't do exactly what we said immediately, that somehow we began to believe we had lost faith in our American system. We told pollsters that. We adopted unrealistic expectations of how much pain we should be asked to endure. We were entitled to a life free of pain. It wasn't just physical pain now, it was also emotional pain, psychological pain, humiliation. In politics, compromise or bending to kind of the ideas of and the wills of others, not breaking, but bending, became a dirty word. We can all just do it alone. Under democracy, somehow, we can all just do it alone. Remember, these were years we thought old rules don't apply to us. These were years, you remember, when we thought it normal that several baseball players would hit more than 60 home runs. It happened twice in the entire history of the sport. Here it was like happening almost every year. Like, well, of course, I think the baseball players are better now, or something. We believe that you package enormous amounts of poorly performing home loans, and Standard & Poor's stamps that security, AAA, that's somehow a magnificent place to park our investment money, and we believe that widespread, massive, indiscriminate prescribing of a narcotic painkillers derived from the opium poppy would somehow not result in widespread, indiscriminate drug addiction. We wanted to have it all. The pills were a perfect example of America's desire to kind of have it all. All the pain taken care of, no risk. Risk-free, what a great time to be an American. We've figured out this drug that has been bedeviled the world for 5,000 years. We developed, meanwhile, an intense sensitivity, part of our attempt to avoid pain. We wandered around a thin-skinned nation, just wandering around social media looking to be offended. So that we could then say on social media, I am so offended that whatever. Whether or not person who has offended you actually intended that. You see this all the time. It's a sad thing. Too often we just look to be offended. We became, meanwhile, I think, ferocious in our attempts to keep our kids from feeling pain. So no skinned knees, no consequences from failure. Give trophies to every kid on a team just for showing up. God forbid they feel the pain of not being the most valuable player on their team. As we exalted the private sphere, feared pain, we developed a fear of the public sphere as well. Terrified of letting our kids go outside, terrified of letting them, kind of compete, be outside in the rough and tumble of play with other children. Parents in this country have been prosecuted for letting their kids go to the park alone. That's part of this story, if you ask me. The two worst words, my opinion, in the English language are play date. That is such a sad thing. Just go to the damn house and knock and see if your friends are home, When I was growing up, my mom was from Iowa, and she grew up in Des Moines, but they had a family farm bell. And she brought it with her to Southern California when we moved there. Every afternoon, 6 o'clock on my street, she'd go to the sidewalk with the farm bell, ring that farm bell. All her boys, were 4 of us, we all knew time to run home for dinner. In fact, I think most of the kids on the block just saying, she's running the bell, we better all go home for dinner. Right? Why did she ring that bell? Because she didn't know where the hell we were. Well, one place she knew we would never be is inside the house on a sunny Southern California afternoon. I've been back to that same street a dozen times, I think. It's about 50 miles from where I now live. I have literally yet to see one single solitary human being on that street where I grew up. There's nobody at the park around the corner. Beautiful park. Every amenity you would need in a community park. The one time I saw people, I take that back. I tried to film it driving down with my little camera, my phone, just to say, this is my street. Didn't look like this when I was growing up. There were actually people on it then. That's when people notice me and they begin following me, think I'm some kind of child molester, you know? You know, the Atlantic Monthly read a great story, you guys ought to read a while back. It said the kids who grew up in an era of hyperprotection from physical pain, kind of wanted to be bubble wrapped against all pain, were now demanding to be protected from painful ideas as well. And they're going to college demanding trigger warnings. Never heard that term before until I read that. So trigger warning is a warning that college professors are now asked to give students to warn them of disturbing ideas that they are going to encounter in the material of the class. That's why you go to college, though, to be disturbed, right? I mean, when else are you going to be disturbed? It's not in college. We began to act as a culture as if consumption was the path to happiness. Accumulation of stuff was the path to happiness. We built into our suburbs exactly that. Enormous palatial stuff, deep, drenching isolation, and we call that prosperity. Embrace technology that separates us from the world and connects us to the world and separates us from the guy across the street. As a reporter, I could tell you that we believe we are deluding ourselves into believing that 24-hour news is somehow informing us. I'm here to tell you 24-hour news is just like heroin. Same way that heroin addicts all kind of, when they get addicted, they all kind of glom together, talk to people who know about dope, know where to buy dope, know what good dope is on very boring conversations. Same things happen with 24-hour news. We're now in these little bubbles. We talk to people who believe like us, talk like us, pretty boring conversations. We only talk to other people when we're sniping at them on social media. The result of all this, I think, is directly connected to this story of drug addiction across America. We wound up, I think, dangerously isolated, dangerously separate from each other as Americans. Kids no longer play in the street, parks are underused. We feel pain from opposing ideas. My question is, why do we wonder that heroin is everywhere? It seems to me that our very search for painlessness, for convenience, fear of pain, led us to it. I think heroin is the final expression of values we've fostered for the last 35 years in this country. Isolation for the private at the expense of the public. Isolation at the expense of community. Final stuff for a culture convinced that consumption is the path to happiness. Heroin turns every addict into a solitary, narcissistic, self-absorbed hyper-consumer. A person who finds opiates turns away from family, turns away from community, from relatives, and towards buying and using one product. Buying and using one product, and that product is the drug that most makes being alone not just okay, but preferable. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. Heroin is a perfect symptom, I think, for how isolated we become as Americans. How divorced, how much we have killed off or ignored that would bring us together. I believe more strongly than ever, therefore, that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone, it is community. You want to keep kids off heroin? Make sure people in your area do stuff alone, do stuff outside, do stuff together. Let kids ride their bikes, skin their knees. Don't protect them from the consequences of their failure. It seems to me we got away from all that. Got away from that as a community, as a country, as a culture. What's best about this country? We rid ourselves, I think, of things so essential to us as human beings that they literally have no price, and we have been invaded by cheap junk. Heroin, above all, is what you get when you do that. Today, supply of opiates on our street is so potent, so vast, so cheap, that getting into treatment, addiction treatment, it takes months. Getting out is like Russian roulette. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do in America today is get out of treatment. Go back to those neighborhoods that are now awash in dope. Football is now a gateway to heroin addiction in America. Think about that. But that's what happens as a culture when you start believing in silver bullets, easy answers to complicated adult problems. I think the good news, though, really the good news is that there is no solution. We tried the easy solution, we tried one pill for all human pain, regardless of the person, regardless of the pain. Look where it got us. We believed a jail cell for every addict. Look where that got us. I think it's time we stop believing there's an easy way out, that old rules don't apply, that we have in a democracy like ours, we have no need for each other. No, there's no solution. There are many solutions, each of which are small, must be tried together, a symphony of solutions, a community of solutions. And happily, and I'm here to say this very sincerely, happily, none of them is sexy. Not one will do the trick alone. But what's happening today is that counties all across this country are doing that. They are forming groups, working groups, alliances, task forces, whatever you want to call them. They are bringing together people of all walks of life. Rotary, Kiwanis, all these other groups, Little League coaches, recovering addicts, clergy, chambers of commerce, of course, the usual folks, public health, cops, and so on. They are bringing this, they are leveraging these talents, these energies, these budgets, and these expertise that they find in each of these people. It sounds so Pollyannish, right? I mean, working together. But you know what? That's what we were not doing. We have not done really to any profound degree in this country for quite a long time. You are finding it all over this country, little by little. And what's best about this is that nobody is starting with a pilot program. Somebody did let's follow that guy. No, every place I go, people are doing this on their own. It's organically coming out of this most serious problem of death and addiction. People are just kind of figuring it out, and they are messy, and they are not succeeding always, but that doesn't matter. I think what's great about it is that they're trying. We're all kind of half groping towards some eventual solution. So finally, I'd like to say, those of you who are in this room, you have that potential. I think there's a lot of business people here, a lot of doctors, a lot of folks in the healthcare. Whatever the case, you need to lend your voice to these movements. These are happening in county after county after county all across the country. And you can be part of that. You can be part of showing that this is how we now do things. Breaking down that corrosive isolation that has been part of American culture for so long. If you do that, if you add your voice, if you add your expertise, your budget, your background, your energy, I think your community will thank you, your town will thank you, your country will thank you. And I'd just like to say thank you all very, very much. And now I'm happy to take a question or two. Yes, sir. Right there. Yeah.
Much of the heroin is now coming from Mexico. Is there a massive increase in cultivation of poppy plants in Mexico?
Yeah. I lived in Mexico for 10 years, you should know. That's how we got onto this story. I did not get into this story by pills. Most people figure out the pill thing and then heroin comes along. For me, I started with wondering why heroin traffickers were doing such big business. I lived in Mexico when all this was going on. I did not, when I started this research, I did not know what a Vicodin was or not OxyContin. I just was focused, as I said, I was on the drug trafficking. That's what I really. And when I lived in Mexico, really very few Mexican traffickers wanted to traffic heroin. It's viewed as an especially scuzzy drug in Mexico, you should know. Very few heroin addicts in Mexico, really. Rarely do you see that. Other addictions, for sure, but that's not one of them. And so cartels really down there, and the drug trafficking culture as a whole, yeah, there were people who did this, but not a whole lot. Certainly not like cocaine or like meth eventually. And so they were they were just unaware of the market. The only guys that I really were doing it, well, there was a few groups. One group I wrote about in my book, particularly aggressive, but mostly it didn't happen. Then we began to create all these addicts. And then eventually they began to switch to heroin. I'd say by 2007, 8, 9, right about then, you begin to see some of that, 2010 and so on. And that awakens the slumbering giant, which is really an underground FedEx, logistically as sophisticated almost, and certainly as even more profit motivated. And they begin to get, more and more people begin to get into producing, expanding the production of the opium poppy. But then, that's not all that happens. Because they, being completely unregulated, of course, in the underworld, they then figure out fentanyl. And nobody had, I wrote a book about it. I didn't even foresee fentanyl coming on like it has. But fentanyl is actually a no-brainer if you're in the underworld. It's no plant involved. It's a chemically based drug, you may know. Pharmaceutically used, of course. You get in patches, you get lollipops, because it's so potent. You want to control exactly the dosage it gets into a human being. But these guys don't care about that. They start making powder. Powder is very dangerous because you can inhale powder very easily. But they begin to see that there's really no impediment to this, and they begin to figure out fentanyl is like, so if you can't grow poppy, well, so what? Now we got fentanyl. And fentanyl has taken it to a whole other level that's both extraordinarily lethal, but also democratized, small d, the trade. Used to be heroin in our country came from 4 or 5 states on the Pacific Northwest of Mexico. The Pacific side of Mexico, from Guerrero up to Sinaloa, right, on the Pacific side. Now fentanyl has taken the place. It's masquerading as heroin. Sometimes it's just called fentanyl, whatever it is. But it's coming, it could be made anywhere. It could be made in a warehouse and not necessarily Mexico. Hungary, Nebraska, Canada, and you could buy it on the dark web. So all of a sudden, awakening that sleeping giant of the Mexican drug trafficking culture, you also awaken their ingenuity. And fentanyl is part of that. And part of the problem with fentanyl is that it makes it very easy to do what heroin dealers have never been able to do. For years, if you're a heroin addict, someone dies or ODs, that's not a warning. That's an advertisement. I got to get that dope. That's really good dope. But for traffickers, that's the brainwashing you get into as an addict. It's extraordinarily enslaving substance, and it makes you think, I got to get that stuff. But that's against the profit motive of most dealers, because in order to do that, you have to maintain the purity, the potency of your dope, when really what you want to do is cut it. You buy a kilo, you want to cut it to maybe 3 kilos, right? So it was very difficult to create that buzz around your dope, for the most part. Until fentanyl. Now fentanyl makes it extraordinarily cheap to boost the potency of your dope, kill a few people, OD a few people, and pretty soon every addict in the town is like running to your dope. And that's kind of one of the byproducts of things that we just thought didn't understand that would happen. Nobody understood what happened, but that is the situation we now find ourselves in. Yes, sir. People come to me and say, gee, after doing this book, don't you think we should legalize drugs? And I say, well, what about this story makes you think legalizing drugs is a good idea? This starts because of legalized drugs. So I think the story needs to give us some pause for thought, caution, humility, understanding that the lesson behind this story is that if you unleash a massive supply of very potent legal drugs, so it's available everywhere, unlike illegal drugs, it will create havoc. I believe, in fact, in marijuana legalization. However, because I lived in Mexico and I saw that marijuana was the gateway drug for all those cartels, they all started with marijuana. Chapo Guzman was a marijuana trafficker first before he became king of everything, right? So when I lived down there, I saw this was crazy. We need to take that money. Forget ISIS. The most toxic influence in our hemisphere is down there in Mexican traffickers. But That doesn't mean we should legalize all marijuana, because the question remained the same. Will the marijuana change? Shouldn't we legalize marijuana? Yeah, probably, except for now the marijuana, that was 40 years ago. Now the marijuana is 25% THC, 30% THC. That's the chemical that makes you high. Back in the 70s, it was like 3%, 4%. It's just become, so we are losing the major lesson also that we learned from Prohibition. During Prohibition, there was a bunch of stuff they called liquor, right? They called it liquor, but it was really turpentine or whatever, made you blind, gave you the twitches, paralyzed you. Well, I think the modern counterpart in the pot world is a 20, 25, 30, 35% THC pot. Why would we legalize that, right? I think we need to take it very slow. Do what we did in Prohibition, right? After Prohibition, we didn't legalize that stuff. We legalized beer, 3%, wine, 4%, whatever it is. Each state has its own regulatory structure. That's the way it should be. But marijuana, everyone kind of believes it's all good, it's all like cool, dude. And so, but we are missing the key element here, which is the lesson behind this opioid problem, which is you unleash a massive supply of legal, potent drugs without really any thought to the numerous consequences that might come up, like fentanyl with this, and pretty soon. So my feeling is we need to legalize marijuana. We need to study it, but we need to cap the potency. We need to regulate potency like we do with alcohol, right? Regulate potency, to 7%. Be humble about what we don't know. We ran into this pain pill thing like, oh, there was no problem. No other issue would ever would ever come up, and it just blew up in our faces, and it's been catastrophic nationwide. And here with marijuana, I think we are, you guys are gonna have me back in 10 years to explain why we have like demented 19-year-olds smoking this or eating the edibles, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's no attempt to be humble, to be cautious, to say we can take this really slowly. We don't need to legalize every damn thing. And what we're also going to create that I think is very scary is the pot equivalent of big pharma, pot equivalent of big tobacco. Big pot, a lot of people with a lot of money interested in maintaining the status quo. As a reporter, I can tell you that's a scary thing. And I'll talk maybe about the gang thing later if you like. If you don't mind. Yes, ma'am. Right. Well, I would say this, that the pharmaceutical industry has already had changes imposed on it. If you look at, nobody markets those pills the way Purdue Pharma used to, right? The number of pharmaceutical reps has declined, not to where it was in the early 90s, but significantly below. I wrote a poll the other day, 44%, 44% of doctors won't even allow pharmaceutical reps in their office anymore. A lot of big health systems don't allow that. Continuing in medical education is very different. Used to be just to bring them all to Scottsdale and we'll just massage them and have them play golf and leave thinking we're the best thing ever. A lot of that continuing medical education happens online now. I mean, there's a lot of things, but those were early days, kind of. The 90s were these kind of very innocent times when we just figured, what could possibly go wrong, I think what's going to happen now, what I think is the big question with regard to pharmaceutical companies is what happens with all these lawsuits you may have heard about. Lots and lots of attorneys general are lining up to sue these companies. Why? Because this is a problem, as I said, that has been faced and borne by the public. You would not be doing your due diligence, you would be political malpractice to not try to find a new source of funding for the coroners, the jailer, the courts, and on and on and on. And so they have turned to the pharmaceutical companies, just similar to the way we turn to the tobacco companies to help defray some of the costs of that. There's a difference, though, in these suits. The pills are not tobacco. Tobacco has no medical use. These pills actually do have a valid medical use. They're a valid medical role. The role is just not to be in every medicine cabinet in America, which is kind of where we've been headed for quite some time. So I think that kind of thing is part of where we're we'll see how that goes. I am not a lawyer. I have no idea what's going to happen, but it's an interesting thing to watch. One more question. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a really great question. I spent a lot of time in Tijuana, so you have a president who's proposing what I don't actually know what he's proposing, honestly, but it sounds to me like a 2,000-mile wall from Matamoros, Brownsville to San Diego, Tijuana. I don't know. Okay, well, we'll see, I suppose. But a couple of things. Walls have shown to be very good, in fact, at stopping people from crossing. In San Diego, we have 2 walls. You come to San Diego, give me a call, I'll take you down there, you'll see. One wall begins in the ocean. 50 yards into the ocean, the wall starts. It goes for 14 miles, stopping broken only for the legal crossing zones, and then it stops at a big mountain. So they didn't build it up the mountain because the mountain is a better wall than we could ever build. So, but I tell you, Tijuana used to be like the Ellis Island for illegal immigration. Every night, hundreds, not thousands, of people would run across. They would have so many people there that people set up, marketplaces to sell to the mojalos, the migrants. They would sell carne asada. They would have tacos. They would have coffee. They would have shoes. And every afternoon, about 3, they'd set up. And about 3 in the morning, they'd take it all down. They'd start again the next day. When there's before a wall. The wall goes up, ends that. It does push it to Arizona, which is why Arizona has the problem. Arizona never had this problem before. It was in '94 when the first wall goes up. So the walls actually do stop, have a way of controlling and really, in my opinion, imposing a rule of law on the border. They do not. I don't see that they will stop drug flow. They have not stopped drug flow. All the drugs, almost all the drugs that we have in our country today, coming from Mexico, have gone through a wall, have gone through an area with a wall. Right? And heroin is the easiest drug of all to traffic. Heroin doesn't really exist without the underworld. It has no medical use, heroin, right? It has a medical use, but the risks of addiction are so high that it's not really good to use in medicine. The only real reason it exists is because of the underworld. It's a perfect underworld drug. Cheap to make, easy to condense, conceal, easy to cut, and it creates a customer who has to buy your product every single day, 2 or 3 times a day, including Christmas. Right? So it's a trafficker's dream, heroin. Right? And then fentanyl is times 10, right? And so these are very easy drugs to traffic because they're so condensable. A purse like that can contain a significant amount of heroin, far easier than the very bulky cocaine or marijuana. So if you're interested in stopping illegal immigration, walls do a pretty good job. If you're interested in stopping drug flow, I don't think I've seen that. That has not been the case. Border security, more generally speaking, particularly border security working with Mexican partners, has a really high level, I think, a broad potential for working. But the problem is you have to have Mexicans wanting to work with you. And right now, because of rhetoric out of Washington, nobody in Mexico is really interested in working too closely with the United States. That was happening. Mexico had come a long, long way from when I lived there. They were extraditing people right and left. We have all the people who are making headlines as traffickers in Mexico, when I was there, are now in our federal prison system. It's amazing. I occasionally write to these guys, see if they want to interview, Chapo Guzman's just the latest one. There's many, 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 many others. So I think that kind of cooperation, collaborative, community approach is the way we need to work. And I believe walls don't stop drugs from coming through, and they corrode the very thing that we need to really affect this problem, which is a kind of a collaborative effort with Mexico. We could go on for hours about this. I lived down there a long time. It's quite a complicated issue, but just from the time I have, that's kind of the way I would answer your question, sir.
Sam, you came here and you talked about two things. You talked about an epidemic and you talked about community. And we as Rotarians are proud of two things that we are known for. First, our sense of community. We are connectors, and that is our brand. Second, we are proud of our own response to an epidemic, a different epidemic, and that is the epidemic of polio. More than 30 years ago, Rotary became the international leader in the effort to eradicate polio. So our results in that time have brought us to a 99.9% worldwide reduction in the cases, and we are proud of that, and I think Rotarians certainly will look to be leaders and respondents in the current epidemic that we face when it comes to opioids, and certainly in building community. So in your honor for being here today, we as Rotarians are going to make a gift of the purchase of 50 additional doses of the polio vaccine, bringing us just that much closer to a polio-free world. Thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for your patience, and have a good rest of the day.